Welcome to Stanford's Computing and Data Science Building, also known as CODA. Throughout history, great institutions have built more than walls. They've built legacies. Inaugurated in February of 2025, CODA continues Stanford University's tradition of blending practical knowledge with humanistic inquiry. CODA is not just a home for technology, it is a crossroads where computing meets ethics, history, and linguistics. Stanford's three powerhouse programs housed in this building, that is computer science, also known as CS, mathematical and computational science, MCS, and symbolic systems, fuel this vision. Drive innovation, data science expertise, and the study of human cognition. CODA is the next chapter in Stanford's innovation story. It reminds us that history is not static, it is dynamic, data-rich, and thanks to spaces like this, much more accessible than ever. Now let's view Arcades to Algorithm, a 5-minute video story of CODA's vision, design, and construction.
One of Stanford's greatest strengths is low barriers to collaborations across campus. We want to create an environment that enables even more collaboration, and with an even broader group of colleagues, especially those in humanities, social sciences, and professional schools like law and business. So we're super excited that the university has approved construction of a new complex that will bolster these promising new collaborations.
This is an aerial from around 10 years ago. The recently completed Discovery Walk, shown in the red dashed line, connected through the portals of the Clark Center, but really had nowhere to continue in the basic sciences and computer sciences region. In fact, this region, which has been built over time, lacked a cohesive plan or a strong sense of communal space. Our future vision for this region creates a quad with landscape commons. A regional cafe and a centralized below-grade service area have been completed, as well as 2 anchor projects, the Bass Biology Building and the SAP Center. The SAP Center in the renovated Old Chem building not only focused on creating cutting-edge teaching labs and classrooms for biology and chemistry, it also included exterior convening spaces and social areas that support the faculty and students in this area of campus. Long wood benches, curvy lounge chairs, and tables with umbrellas invite community and interaction. The Bass Biology Building serves as an extension of the Discovery Walk, as well as a gateway to the future commons. Its colorful, interactive electronic media mesh reinforces the portal, as well as represents imagery from biology research.
The university recognizes the critical importance of the data science and computation complex.
We need an ecosystem where great ideas can find the tools and methods and collaborators they need to incubate and thrive. An ecosystem that'll make our research better, inspire us to ask new questions, and find ways to generate new knowledge. I see this new building complex as a critical fulcrum for this ecosystem.
The complex will be an interdisciplinary hub sitting literally at the crossroads of engineering and H&S. It will be at the corner of Lomita Mall and Jane Stanford Way, right on the Oval, a phenomenal location. The complex will have 2 connected buildings housing a variety of people and programs. There will be faculty from computer science and statistics, and there will be programs like the Data Science Initiative and the Brown Institute for Media Innovation. The complex will also be teeming with undergraduates as it becomes the new home for 3 of Stanford's most popular majors: computer science, MCS, and symbolic systems.
Data science happens in every single field and in every single pocket of the university. The Summer of Data is part of the Data Science Institute, which is a new initiative at Stanford to weave data science throughout the fabric of the university.
One of the great things that makes Stanford so special is just being able to work with people that have different perspectives and different ideas. It's also really great to have a building that will allow us to run into people with different majors.
When I was an undergraduate, there was no place for people to gather to work together on problem sets or discuss coursework or research opportunities. And I think having a dedicated location for that will be invaluable.
The creation of new natural community spaces will create new opportunities for social interaction and help include more diverse student populations who might otherwise lack direct pathways to inclusion. We have done a remarkable job meeting the needs of our students, but we can do even better if teachers and students have an environment designed around best practices, social interaction, group work, teaching support, and accessible faculty.
In our rapidly changing world, more data is available than ever, and the kinds of research we can do with this data would have been unimaginable to scholars even 20 years ago. Think about projects mapping income mobility by zip code, those tracking land and livestock used to predict food insecurity, and projects using data to aid human health. We need groups of scholars working on these issues from many different disciplines.
The data science and computation complex is truly a vital part of the future of the university.
Now it is my great honor to introduce Sam Miller, the architect behind CODA and a Stanford graduate in civil engineering class of 1984. Sam Miller is the managing partner of LMN Architects. At LMN, his main passion is to guide the firm's collaborative culture and foster innovation. He coordinates the firm's sustainability initiative to explore and advance low-carbon design solutions. Sam leads LMN's Tech Studio, an experimental research group that explores digital design technologies and data-informed approaches to design and fabrication. In addition to CODA, Sam's Seattle projects include a central library, an art museum expansion, an Asian art museum renovation and expansion. He has also designed University of Iowa's Waxman Music Building. His current San Francisco projects include Stanford's Commons at Campus Center and the Diego Rivera Theater. Please join me in giving Sam a warm Stanford welcome.
Well, thank you all very much. It's a real treat to be here. As Sapna mentioned, I am an alum at Stanford, and it's really very rewarding to be back and to be working on campus and to be sharing with you kind of what our process was like in kind of bringing this building to fruition. So I'm hoping to share a little bit of, the backstory of kind of how this came to be, kind of what our design process is like, maybe some things you might be less familiar with, and we're going to have some Q&A afterwards. So if any of this is not clear, be sure to ask me a question as we go. I wanted to start with a little bit about me. So I grew up in Palo Alto. I went to school at Pali and Walter Hayes and what was Jordan, and came across El Camino to go to Stanford. I always liked to build things, forts in the backyard, big holes at the beach. And so it's kind of in my DNA is to build things. I was in the civil engineering program here, eventually went to architecture graduate school at the University of Washington, and there I stayed. But my family are here, my brother, 2 sisters, and my cousin. They're all here to support, and it's fun to be able to come down and work on a project and visit my family at the same time. So I'm very grateful for all of that. I also took Paul Turner's Introduction to Architectural History class in 1982. I took it pass-fail because I was in civil engineering and I didn't have time or space in my program for those types of humanities projects, but I passed happily and was very inspired by that work. And I took a few other architectural history classes while I was here, and that was, I think, the beginning of my arc towards becoming an architect instead of a builder. I also want to dispel a myth. Architecture is not a solo practice. We use a shorthand for saying this is a such and such building by a particular architect, often white males, and really anything can be further from the truth. Architecture is a team sport. It is literally hundreds of people working on a project. This is the list of just our LMN architecture team that worked on the project in the 6 years that it was designed and constructed. And you can see over 21 people years adding up to that. So it is a very large undertaking, and my role was actually relatively small compared to all of the other efforts that were part of this. And so I just want to remind everybody that, when we say, oh, that's a Frank Lloyd Wright building, or that is a, H.H. Richardson building, really it's not. It's a whole crew of people behind supporting and making these things happen. So it's a team. And just very briefly, just kind of an overview of the schedule. These projects take some time. So we were selected for the project in 2019. And we started with what's called programming, and I'm going to explain to you what that is in just a moment. And finished the program. It was about a 6-month effort, and we finished that right at the beginning of 2020, and then the pandemic hit. So all of our design work happened during the pandemic remotely. And that came with a set of challenges, but as I think all of us know, we somehow managed to navigate all that and get through it, and it worked. But it did, kind of change the dynamic of Zoom meetings instead of in-person meetings and those kinds of things. But we learned a lot through that. And then there was about 1.5 years of permitting. Getting through the county is no small task, and we were able to do that. And then about 2.5 years of construction. So about 6 years all told until the dedication that was earlier this year. I don't know if anybody recognizes this I'm going to say all of the slides I'm going to show you starting now are slides that came from our design presentations to the clients. So these are, kind of real-time things. Nothing's been kind of post-produced. And so this gives you a sense of the types of material we're producing throughout the design process. This graphic is the Lomita and LeSueur malls, and it's the grid of Stanford oriented towards the campus, true north. So we start this programming exercise. Programming is think of it, if you're a cook, think of it as the recipe for what it is you're going to be making. It's all the ingredients, if you will, of what's going to go into the building. And so at the end of the programming effort, you have a space list of all the different types of spaces you're going to have within the building, what size they're going to be, how many of them there are, and what adjacencies, what types of activities are going to be happening within them. That's the program. And so what we start with at a high level when we begin this effort is to really start with the vision. What is the client's vision for what this building wants to be? And that vision can evolve over time, but that is the touchstone that we always come back to throughout the process, because everything we do has to be in support of this big vision that's been described and defined. And here, the original name for this building was called the Bridge Building. I don't know if you're familiar with that. And the idea was that it was bridging all the different academic units, researchers, collaborators around the campus. It was an opportunity to kind of bridge that. And you heard a little bit of that in the video that was shown to you. And so this working together piece is really the key, is this intersection and this place for people to come together and to come across one another and to learn from each other and to grow. More specifically, we have a place on the campus, and how do we cultivate that community kind of with a building, and how do we create this bridge to these other disciplines? And it's other academic units across the campus, but it's also, industry off of campus as well, and other institutions. So it's obviously very aspirational and kind of a high-level goal of being this bridge to the different academic departments within the campus, but it's also a really exciting one. And then more specifically, as you heard on the video, there were 2 different departments and 7 institutes and programs that were kind of envisioned to be part of this project, and 3 buildings in particular, because as part of the programming, we looked at the existing Gates and Sequoia halls. Gates was the home for computer science, Sequoia the home for statistics, and this was going to be a mashup of some of all of those folks. And so we needed to step back and look at the whole ecosystem academically of how these departments and institutes were going to work together and what role the Bridge Building at the time was going to play in doing that. We also worked with SOPNA and others on the client side to kind of define kind of the project criteria. So these are, very foundational kind of things that we want to achieve with this project. There's cultural elements that are some of the things we've been talking about community and research and collaboration. But then, of course, the physical, the campus framework, the architectural context, the history that's so important to the campus and all of you. And this somewhat cryptic graphic on the right is a graphic we developed, our team developed fairly early on. It's a little hard to read, but this idea of all these different institutes and organizations and academic departments and how do they all kind of interweave and connect with one another, and what can this building do to kind of support that cross-fertilization, if you will. So programming, as I said, the outcome of programming is, a room list. We need 100 offices, we need 20 classrooms, we need, et cetera. But really, the way we start and approach programming is different. We want to work with what we call activity-based programming. So we don't want to know how many rooms do you need. We want to know what do you need, what do you want to do? And what types of physical spaces do you need in order to do that? And from that, we kind of back into, okay, in that case, we need these types of rooms, and it's not a straightforward, we need X number of offices. It's much more of an analysis of the activities and the goals of the project and of the users of the project, and then build up the program from there. And there's both quantitative metrics that we're using to evaluate these things, but also, importantly, qualitative ones, so that the vision and the kind of the way people are working is represented in the built outcome. This process, this programming process, you can see at the far left, it starts with individual meetings and engagement with all of the different independent kind of institutes and departments and users of the building, if you will. What we do not want is for each of those groups to be siloed within the building in their own little corner of the building. And as we met with those folks on the far left, we started to see common themes being developed across that would cross over from one group to another, that there were certain ways of approaching research or collaboration or teaching that were shared in common across those different groups. And so after we had the individual workshops with the individual departments and institutes, we then went through a series of themed workshops where we talked about kind of broader themes of how this was going to work within the building and how we could leverage the common interests across those different organizations. From that, we developed different options, kind of different planning scenarios. We haven't designed a thing yet where this is all on paper. We're just thinking through how can we start to think about organizing this? What are the things that are going to be in this building that are going to help you achieve what it is you aspire to and meet all of the various needs that have been defined in all of these conversations? And then we identify a preferred concept, and that's when design starts. So engagement's a really important part of that. It means reaching out and having lots of conversations. And this are a couple of photos of faculty on the left and graduate students on the right, where we had like hands-on workshops. It always helps to pin stuff up on the wall and get reactions to things. But really good and fruitful dialogue with a whole host of folks to hear kind of what they aspire to and what is going to work for them. And some of the feedback from the faculty. Now, I know must be better than working from home is kind of a low bar, but this was the pandemic, and there was, kind of some people who kind of liked working at home. So one of the aspirations was to make it so inspiring that people would not want to be at home, but actually come and work in the building. So, but you can see other things. Coffee is a frequent thing, which this, if you haven't been, is apparently, I'm not a coffee drinker, but I've heard it's some of the best coffee on campus downstairs. That helps. And from the students, I think really interesting and insightful kind of observations from them. And this balance between quiet and social, I think, Stanford students are very intense and smart and work hard, but they also need, a community in which to do that. So it's a combination of both of those things, which I think is really interesting. And collisions and spontaneous mixing is another, I think, really important kind of aspect of what we're trying to achieve in this building. So out of all of that comes the program, and the program is represented in that pie chart proportionally. So you can see the majority of the space that we provided is supporting research and collaboration. There are some what we would call community spaces, the coffee shop, this space, and some other kind of gathering spaces. And then, of course, there's teaching spaces as well, primarily down at the garden level, at the lowest level, but there's a seminar room on level 1 as well. So research and collaboration were the greatest piece of this project, and we wanted to start to think about, okay, well, that's all good, but how do we organize this? And so these are diagrams, very kind of theoretical at a high level, starting to think about how do you create research neighborhoods? And do the faculty offices are they all together, or are they spread out? Are the grad students nearby? Are the research areas nearby? What are the different ways of thinking about kind of ways in organizing this and facilitating kind of that dialogue? And out of this, back and forth, came this diagram, which is a very foundational diagram, and I'm going to refer back to it throughout the talk, because this is essentially the diagram of this building before we had done any design work. And what it's saying is there would be research neighborhoods, which are in green, and then we have what we eventually term the hive, which is the in-between space where all the researchers and collaborators can be moving through on their way to and from places. They can grab coffee, they can sit with colleagues at a table and work through something. And that is really the glue that's going to hold all this together, because that's where these, kind of discoveries happen. There's spontaneity of discovery and collaboration and seeing what your colleagues are working on. And if they're locked away in another part of the building, you're never going to see it. But if what they're doing is visible somehow out throughout the rest of the building, you're going to run into them, you're going to overhear something, and you're going to put 2 and 2 together and make a connection. And that's what we were striving for with this building. And so this proved to be a very important diagram kind of going forwards. This was our touchstone, if you will, from a design standpoint. At the same time we're working on the programming, simultaneously we're looking at the campus context and the site. And that's obviously very important. Having just finished Paul Turner's lecture, you know what this is. This is the Olmsted/Stanford plan. And this, obviously, our site at the intersection of the Oval and across from the old quad, diagonally across from the old quad, across from the Oval, very important site, and really required a lot of thought and care and planning about what happened, and working with Sapna and Dave Lennox, the campus architect, and others to make sure that our response was going to be appropriate. This is an aerial view of the campus with our site in red, and I just, as I was putting this together, I kind of looked at this with fresh eyes and realized it's really interesting because you can see all the red clay tile roofs of the more historic parts of the campus. And then to the left, is the medical and engineering side of the campus, which is obviously more contemporary. And that plays a really important role in where we landed here, because we are at the intersection of those two things. We have SAP Center, we have the old quad, the Oval, obviously really important historic elements that we want to be mindful of and respectful of and be informed by. But at the same time, we're kind of bridging to a newer part of the campus where the architecture is more contemporary. And Sapna mentioned there is a thought to create a new quadrangle in kind of the center here between SAP Center and Bass Biology. The intention is to tear down the buildings that are in the center right over here and create a new quadrangle eventually. So this portion of the building is going to be facing out into an academic quadrangle. So there's all of the kind of evolution of what's going to be happening on the campus that we need to be mindful of and be thinking about. Early on, Sapna and others gave us kind of what they felt were important key site design criteria that we should be designing to. And these were, and here you can see the new science quad is represented in this image here. And so this is, again, we haven't designed anything. We're just analyzing, here's our site. What are the influences? What are the things we're going to be thinking about as we start to design the building? Interestingly, number one never came to fruition. There was an idea that we might connect below grade to the SAP Center classroom. So our walk today would have been much easier. You could have just gone through a corridor under the paving. But that proved to be very difficult with all the utilities and everything else that are out there. But most of these others, I think, were executed in some way as we moved forward with the project. Here is a photo of the Lomita Mall before our project, and you can see the SAP Center on the right, of course. And then this is the old Heron Hall that was here prior. And it's a little hard to see because of the trees, but it stepped out and then actually stepped out again into Lomita Mall. So it was violating the Lomita Mall geometry, and it was of an era where they were playing fast and loose. Meyer Library was another one where they started to interrupt. Yeah, that's a loaded one, I know, but. So one of the goals that we were intending to adhere to was to abide by the setback that SAP Center provides for Lomita Mall, to restore Lomita Mall back to its full width, which allows for more pedestrian and bike parking, of which there's loads, of course. We also were looking at the massing of the building. Again, we haven't designed anything. We're just testing, kind of scale and size and relationship to Old Chem or SAP Center in particular. We didn't want to shade the Gilbert side too much. So there were a lot of analyses of kind of massing and different ways of approaching the site from a building height standpoint. And then trees. Very vitally important on the campus. And of course, there's some live oaks around the perimeter of the site, and we absolutely wanted to do everything we could to preserve those throughout the construction project, and to be sensitive to that component of the project. So there was a lot that was done in the planning and the execution to make sure that the trees were protected. So with those two things, kind of combining site and program, we start playing with ideas. And all of those people I showed you before, they're generating lots and lots of ideas. And this is but a small sample of the types of ways that we start to look at the arrangement of the programmatic elements to think about how do we create that ecosystem of collaboration and research that we've been describing and exploring throughout the programming process. And you can see the beginnings of what we ended up with in some of these schemes where we started to identify kind of an element that was, two separate elements, if you will. But there's a wide variety of different ways of thinking about it and exploring. And we tested all of these, including in physical model, to get a sense of the proportion and what they do with the site in relation to the other buildings on campus and in the vicinity. And that's an important part of how we work. We like to build stuff still. And here's some what ifs. These are schemes that got taken a little bit further that ended up on the cutting room floor, if you will. But just to give you a sense of, some ideas that were developed that I think were interesting and had interesting aspects to them. This one, I think what's interesting here is it really kind of steps away from SAP Center and creates a diagonal kind of entry into this future quadrangle, and is kind of respectful of the SAP Center in a kind of by distancing itself from it, but it also backs up to Gilbert and creates not a particularly nice exposure kind of within Gilbert. This is another version that's kind of similar to that with a different kind of approach. Here's an idea of a element that would come out and have articulation on the Lomita Mall side that would start to represent or reflect some of what's happening with Old Chem and creating kind of different spaces. But in the end, and this is a very early diagram of essentially where we landed, was this idea of two elements, a bar and an object are the terms we used. We also sometimes called them the bat and the ball. And so this idea, and then stitched together with a bridge element, which becomes the hive, connecting the two together. And the bar is rectilinear. It's very much relates to the geometry of Old Chem and the other historic buildings, kind of on the quad area, whereas the object building obviously is more contemporary, facing kind of the more contemporary side of the campus. So there's kind of a dual personality to the building, if you will. We studied, once we kind of started landing on a general approach to what we thought we wanted to do, there's a lot of nuance in thinking about the shaping of these pieces and how they connect together and create kind of that ecosystem that we're looking for. And also in 3 dimensions, we're studying the massing to look at what we think is appropriate, massing and relationship, again, to the campus and the precinct. Likewise, we did a lot of analysis and study of the Barr building, particularly as it relates to Old Chem. Old Chem is, this venerable, beautiful building, and once we're done, I hope they can lift the shades up and you'll get the full view of the roof, which is really spectacular from this room. But we were very mindful of the history and the prominence of that building and trying to be very respectful of it in thinking about the materiality, the articulation of the facade as it's moving in and out. Our Old Chem has a very kind of deliberate way of doing that. In fact, I have another shot here. So this is an analysis. We're not proposing any changes to Old Chem, but this is just analyzing the Old Chem facade and thinking about how it's articulating itself and thinking about how can that inform how this building can do something similar. We don't want to be completely mirroring it, but we want to be informed by it in terms of proportionality, materiality, and be a respectful neighbor, if you will, to Old Chem. So here's a rendering that was done fairly early in design to give, as we were starting to study it further and get a feel for those things and making sure that we were, kind of heading down the right path on this side of the building where it's obviously clearly referencing these historic elements. Here's another view of that from above so you can get a sense of that. It is a taller building. It's 1 floor taller than Sapp Center. And that, we spent a lot of time thinking about that. I do think there's something to be said for increased density in the center of campus, because as the campus grows, it's either going to grow up or it's going to grow out. And there's a lot of valuable open space around this campus that we want to keep as open space. And also the other advantage to density on campus is you get a certain amount of energy and kind of, activity that's happening with people coming and going. And so I think it has to be done right, but if it's done carefully and thoughtfully, a little bit more density is not a bad thing in our mind. From the site standpoint, again, you can see here the relationship to Sapp Center and preserving Lomita Mall, back to its original width, which was a really important keystone for what we were trying to do. You can also see the object building here is curving and stepping back from Gilbert to try and give Gilbert as much access to daylight and views, so we're not blocking too much of that on that side. And then for the future quadrangle out here, there'll be a relationship, of course. And so if I reference back to that original diagram that I mentioned that was so important with research and the hive in the middle, this is an earlier diagram. This is missing the top floor of the Barr building, and it doesn't have the feature stair, but it is kind of an early design study of showing how this hive and how this interdisciplinary interaction is going to happen. And so this idea is the research and collaboration spaces are on the 2 buildings, and in between the bridge becomes the hive. And that was a really important kind of piece of how this came together. And then, of course, there's the student study and classrooms on the garden level and the public meeting space, which we're in right now at the top. So here you can see, again, these aren't kind of final design, but this is about halfway through design. This is what it started to look like. This is the ground floor. A big piece of this was multiple entries, trying to make the building as porous as possible so you could enter it from many different ways and enter into that kind of center organizing element of the hive space. And then on the upper floors, the research floors, here's where the hive really kind of plays out. And it's Sunday afternoon, so it's not going to be super busy, but if you ever have a chance, come back in middle of the week and see the activity levels that are here. It's really amazing and inspiring to see. So the hive with the hive stair is here, but we also have a series of meeting rooms around each of these hive spaces on every floor. And there's glass into those meeting rooms, and many of them have operable partitions so they can actually open up into the Hive space. And the idea here is let's say there's a guest lecturer giving a lecture here, and you're coming in to go get a cup of coffee, and you see on the presentation screen something that the guest lecturer is speaking of, and suddenly you're like, oh, I need to go talk to so-and-so about this because that's really interesting along the lines of what we're doing. So trying to make the activities, the collaborative activities that are happening within the building visible to everybody within the building so that everybody can see what's happening, and sharing in that energy and sharing in the activity that's happening so that those discoveries and those spontaneous, things can be discovered and happen by seeing the activity that's going on within. And then the Hive also acts as the students ask for, a quiet, alone space. They can sit off in a corner and get their work done, or they can pull up a table and sit with others and do group work. Landscaping was very important, obviously, throughout this process, being a really beautiful campus to start with and an important part of the campus. And here, the trees, obviously, the retained trees play a really important role. There are not as many trees along the east edge of the building here because that's where Heron Hall was. And when Heron Hall stepped back, it left a void, if you will. But we've planted trees there with the hope that over time, that will fill out and be equally dense and rich in the tree canopy as around the existing trees around the perimeter. And then the other thing I would say is the microclimates are an important part of what we were trying to work through. And with the great weather that the Bay Area is blessed with, having a south-facing sunken courtyard that has great access to light, but is also a little bit more shaded, has covered tables and things, so you can get a variety of sun and shade, protected from the wind. And then the north terrace, the one we walked through on the way from SAP Center to get to here, is on the north side of the building, so maybe more appropriate for a warmer day, when you're trying to stay in the shade and those kinds of things, but trying to create a variety of different types of spaces that people will want to be in. Just one example of kind of the level of exploration that we were working on is in the South Garden Court, our landscape architect, there was this idea of some kind of a paving that would happen down there that would be rich, it would be reflective of kind of the look and feel of Stanford, but and this is kind of some examples of some of the things they were looking at. And this is a rendering that was done during design to kind of show kind of the character of what that might look like. And I think that paving out there, if you have a chance to see it, is really worth looking at. It's really beautiful, and I think it really invites you to go out there and experience that space. The one thing this rendering very optimistically shows is a big green wall. That's currently a concrete retaining wall. And as beautiful as concrete is, it's our hope it is planted, and the idea is that it will fill in and become a green living wall eventually, hopefully in a couple years' time. Sustainability, very important in all the work that we do on our projects, and there's a lot of aspects of sustainability, materiality, and other things, but just one example of kind of the level of rigor we bring is, solar heat gain is a big energy use in buildings, and we have to be really thoughtful and careful about trying to get daylight and views in and out, but at the same time trying to limit the amount of sun coming into the building because the heat gain has a big energy use. So we did a lot of analyses of the different facets of the building, what orientation they were in, and what types of shading strategies we could use to kind of optimize the performance of the building, and that reduces energy use, which reduces carbon footprint. And then we do analytical analysis of all the different facades, different times of the year to evaluate the performance and to make adjustments in the geometry. So these terracotta fins, which you can see on the outside of the building, are spaced very carefully to optimize for performance on the solar heat gain. And then the Hive mock-up stair mock-up. So the Hive stair is a feature stair for the building, obviously. It's a really important kind of architectural element to connect the floors. And we feel it wasn't done because we really wanted to do a neat stair, but it was done to really encourage people to use the stair and to, again, run into colleagues, run into others on the stair, and to really make it feel like the Hive is both a horizontal and a vertical piece. And so this stitches that together. Obviously very complicated geometrically, and we wanted to study it and really make sure we got it right. So we have a 7,000 square foot shop that we do a lot of mock-ups and prototyping within in our office. And so we built a full-scale mock-up of a portion of the stair to test lighting, to test constructability, and the perf pattern of ones and zeros on the panels, just to test kind of all that out at scale to make sure we were designing something that could get built. And so now I'll finish with just some images of what this looks like from my angle. That looks really weird, but I guess it looks better from over there. So here is the Lomita Mall side of the building. As I mentioned, trying very carefully to think about proportion, articulation, relationship to SAP Center and the historic quad, and being responsive to that context while not trying to mimic it. But then as you move around the building, obviously you get to the object building and the hive, and it becomes more contemporary. You can see the beginnings of it here, but the west side of the bar building changes its approach to the facade, and it starts to break down and become more related to the facade of the object building by using the terracotta fins and other elements to start to relate to that. I'll show you another photo that shows that. You can see the paving pattern in the garden court that I mentioned, and of course the hive stair, which is really terrific, and it's made all the better with Camille Utterbach's art piece. She's a professor here for those who know her, and she did the installed art piece that interweaves its way through the stair. Here we have the view from the future quad side of the building, and again, the more contemporary side. Here you can also see how the solid punched opening facade of the bar building wraps the corner and becomes a different treatment where it has some of the precast elements, but it starts to take on some of the vocabulary of the object building to kind of blend into it to make it a coherent whole, so it's not a stark contrast between solid and the bar and the object. Here's the garden court, which is really fun to see people hanging out in day and night. This is the entry from Jane Stanford Way. We have a colonnade. We don't have any arcades, but there is an arcade or a colonnade to enter into the building from this side as well as from the north side that we walked through. And you can see Gilbert there in the background. Here is the hive space with the hive stair working its way through and the collaboration that's happening there day in and day out. And then this is kind of an image of one of the conference rooms I mentioned where there's transparency glass connecting you into the hive. So what's happening in these rooms is visible to those on the outside, and you can see the activity, see what's going on, see who's meeting, seeing what's being talked about, and make connections as appropriate. And then just some really good, spaces. I mean, I think a really important part of learning on a campus is the learning that happens outside of the classroom. Sometimes we call that seamless learning environments, where it's not just you're in the classroom and you walk out of the classroom and you're done learning. You're learning all the time when you're on campus. And so these types of spaces in academic buildings are vitally important for students to be connecting with one another, studying, working together, and kind of continuing to learn and grow as part of their time on campus. And one of the teaching spaces, this is a seminar room on level 1, which is, there's a very high student occupancy with all the classrooms, which is great to see. And there's these big surges of students that come in and out, like a tidal, flow of people coming in and out. So I want to finish with this. I've always believed that, I'm an architect not because I like to build buildings, but because I like people. And for us, it's not about creating this architectural piece. It's about the activities that are happening in it and the people that are in it and what they're going to do to go out and change the world. And our building wants to be supportive of that, but it doesn't want to be it's not the show stealer, it's the thing that supports it. So we've always thought of our work as vessels that are in support of the activities that are happening within the buildings. And it's really, really great to see the level of activity and the level of use that this building's gotten right out of the gate, because it is going to make a difference. It's really going to make a change. So that's really inspiring to see. Thank you.
Thank you very much, first and foremost. That was amazing. And when he says that this building is totally occupied, he's not joking. I was here on Friday, and somebody came up to me and said, is there an exam? How come there is no seat to sit at? Because there are students everywhere. Do Stanford students not like party on Friday nights? But really, it's become a very popular building. It is all the time occupied, including weekends. I've come over here during the weekends, and I see people constantly over here. And when you leave, you will see that the building is really, really occupied. So I have a few quick questions for you, Sam.
Sure.
And some of them are just to do with your student years here. During your student years, describe a space on Stanford campus that fostered a meaningful relationship, not just in how you learned, but how you also connected with the community.
That's good. So I was here 80 through 85-ish, and there were a number of things that were happening on campus at the time I was here. We were talking about this earlier. The Braun Music Building was getting built, which blocked my access from the row into campus, which drove me crazy. But I think, and I also studied at Terman Engineering Building, which had a bit of a faded history. But clearly the quad and the places around the quad, that Paul so eloquently kind of shared with us today was, kind of the inspirational space that we could really all draw from and love, for sure, right out of the get-go.
So the quad, my favorite place too. Looking back, which architectural decision in Stanford's history do you think has the most lasting impact on its culture and community?
Well, I think this applies to the town center, but I think what Stanford is a premier institution in the United States, and we work on a lot of campuses around the country, and everybody wishes they could be like Stanford. But what I think Stanford is trying to do, which I think is really important, is to create a whole student, a whole person. And it's the academics are there, but you need the social engagement and the connection with one another and this sense. I mean, as I was saying about architecture being a team sport, when you go out in the world, you're not you against the world. It's you with a bunch of people, working on things together. And so I think the social aspect of the work that Stanford's doing, trying to foster and facilitate social interaction in the academic buildings, is really important.
Well said. And your building represents that. And he's working also on the campus center, which is all about student engagement and faculty engagement and bringing the community together. So based on that, actually, I'm going to skip to the question that is more relevant to this. Stanford has always been a place of innovation. How do you see architecture playing a role in shaping the university's future identity?
Yeah. So it's interesting, and this being the Stanford Historical Society, we might have a lively debate about this. I'd be curious to hear what others think. But there are campuses around the United States that have very strict kind of architectural guidelines that have to be kind of historicist, if you will. They want to mimic their collegiate Gothic or whatever style it is on their campus. And to me, and I think architects generally feel like that's a real lost opportunity, that the buildings that get built should be respectful of the historic fabric and character, but should also, be of their time. And to me, it's a little disingenuous to build a building today that looks like it's 100 years old. And so I think Stanford is doing a good job of. It's a very fine line. In the old historic part of the campus, you have to be really thoughtful and careful. But as you get further away from the center of the historic portion, being more adventurous and still, thinking about the legacy. It wants to be authentic. We sometimes use that word. Authentic in terms of being of this place, of Stanford, but it doesn't want to be, kind of historicist or kind of a faux look. And I think Stanford's done a really good job of that. Other campuses, not so much.
Yeah, you're right. We always have to play the balancing act, and this building is a good representation where there was a duality built in because there was, being respectful neighbor to its original.
That's right.
I felt like today was, introducing the new baby to its original original neighbors. But yeah, we're respectful and at the same time innovative and cutting edge. So in CODA, visibility, vitality, and community were prioritized over efficiency. If you could imagine Stanford's campus 50 years from now, do you think these post-pandemic infused values and culture will endure or change? And let me preface this. I remember that, once I came to campus, a lot of the times I would see that Stanford students are heads down working. And, the community spaces were not kind of like our main quad is an empty space in the middle, unless the bikes are kind of crossing across. But otherwise, it's empty. So the pandemic has changed that, and there is a lot of focus on trying to create social engagement.
That's right.
So do you think this is going to stick?
I do. I really do. I mean, humans are social animals. And I think, there was a period during the pandemic when people kind of enjoyed working from their home in their pajamas. But I think if we can create the spaces that people want to be, getting back to what the faculty feedback said, that's going to inspire people to want to be together and just like we're all here together. Well, not all, sorry for those of you on Zoom, but it's really, there's no replacing the human interaction that comes with in-person getting together. And as I said, the seamless learning environment, creating space for students to grow, not just in the classroom, but across kind of their whole academic experience is really important. And so buildings need to be addressing that.
Great. I'm going to ask you the last question and then open it up to the public. If you were to guide your family, and I know all of your family is over here right now, on Hidden Gems tour of Stanford architecture, name 3 buildings you would highlight and explain why.
Wow, that's a good one. Okay, and I'm not prepared for this, so I'm going to wing it. Well, let's see. I think I might start with an outdoor space, which is the Papua New Guinea area. I think that's really a hidden gem that people don't, and maybe right next to it is it Windover?
Yes.
Which is beautiful and amazing. Also a bit of a hidden gem. Both my daughters went to school here. Neither of them had seen either of those things when I came to visit, and I was like, okay, we're going to go. Let's see, what other hidden gems are there? Frost Amphitheater was also a really amazing spot that's gotten even better. And what else? The D School, I think, is a really interesting kind of academic space that we've been inspired by and looking at. So that's another one. Maybe that's enough.
Great. I always like to think of just like how you ended your slideshow, which is that most buildings are actually just like the envelope that carries the letter. We don't call.
That's right.
We say it's the letter, like what have you received, a letter. We don't talk about the envelope. But the envelope is what facilitates the letter reaching from one place to the other. And that's how we think of our buildings, that the buildings are just meant to make sure that the community comes together and the great work that happens at Stanford actually continues happening, and we enable that to happen through the building's envelope.
That's right. It's a vessel.
It's a vessel.
That's right. Go ahead.
Thank you for your very, very engaging presentation. And I'd like to ask a question about a building here that was built around 25 years before this, if I remember, the Clark Center. As I remember, that was the product of a conscious decision to facilitate collaboration among the biological sciences, chemistry, engineering, and medicine.
Right.
Were there lessons learned from the Clark Center that you were able to apply here to foster collaboration among the disciplines represented in this building?
That is a good question. We toured a number of buildings on campus, including the Clark Center, which is a really interesting building, and also projects on other campuses as well to try and learn from that. The Clark Center is a little different. It is a lab building. It's got wet labs. It's very kind of it's got a different program. This is mostly, kind of dry research that's happening in this building. But I think some of the idea of how you circulate on the interior of that building and can see, the transparency of what you're seeing kind of happening in the different labs and the different spaces, I think makes its way into the Hive a little bit. I think there is some of that. That's an interesting question.
Could you say something about how the constraints of earthquake proofing the building may have impacted on your design criteria and selection?
Yeah, fortunately, since, what the buildings of the era Paul showed, earthquake engineering's come a long ways. And so this is a very stout building, as are all buildings being built right now on campus. Stanford has an independent seismic review committee that has structural engineering professors and others on the committee. So in addition to the code requirements, Stanford kind of reviews and decides the level of performance they want for their buildings, which is typically more stringent than code. Because code, from a seismic standpoint, code is just trying to preserve or protect the occupants of the building so that you can get out of a building. In the case of an earthquake, it's not meant to protect the building itself. A code successful building in an earthquake would be one that stays up so that everybody gets out and is safe, but then you have to tear the building down because it's damaged to the point that it can't be used going forwards. That's really all the code is only focused on life safety. Stanford, I think, is progressively spending a little bit more money on their buildings with the goal of trying to keep them, usable and survivable from an earthquake. So it's quite rigorous.
So we saw from Paul's presentation the conflict sometimes with the architect and the builder and the owner, and you are prior a civil engineer and now an architect. Is there anything in your background as a civil engineer that has helped you being a better architect?
Yeah, well, I like to think so. Actually, it was funny. I was just giving a lecture earlier this week to a University of Washington class, and a woman came up afterwards, and she was also trained as a civil engineer, and asked me what that was about. And what I like to say is, I still need structural engineers to do the design work on our buildings, but what I do like to think is I'm a little more informed and can ask better questions and maybe get a little closer to the right answer to start by having my engineering background. So I do feel it's really served me well. The great thing about architecture is it's this amalgamation of, engineering and art and politics and social, sociology and everything else. And so everybody comes at it with an expertise, but my engineering background definitely helped me in kind of collaborating with engineers on the project.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about something that you learned through this project?
That's an interesting question. Learned a lot about data science, which has been great, and the kind of the activities that are happening within. And we're doing other data science projects around the country now, kind of as a result of kind of the expertise we've developed on that. I learned a lot about the campus, thanks to Sapna and Dave, and the kind of the history and kind of the important kind of parameters and thinking about different aspects of the campus. And campuses evolve, and what was happening on the campus in the 50s through the 70s is different from what's happening on the campus now. And so kind of what's the current, thinking about what the approach to the precinct is. And that was all very inspirational and really exciting to, be a part of.
Also, just so that you know that there is a data science building opening up all across the United States. MIT has one that opened last year or the year before, and Penn has one. Every university is opening one. Berkeley's just about to open theirs as well.
Yeah.
What budget were you given at the beginning of the project, and was that budget adjusted as the project went on?
Well, I'm going to have to defer to Sapna on that. We've been instructed when we use this as an example, sometimes clients, ask for projects examples, and we are required to say that it was confidential, the cost of this project, because Stanford's a private institution, and they can do that. If it were a public institution, they would have to disclose it. So we generally don't disclose the cost information on the project, but it did come in on budget. The project did.
And it does go through a very rigorous process with the Board of Trustees in terms of getting it approved, the budget. So it's all benchmarked and rigorously looked at. Yes?
Is this building designed primarily to foster interaction among people with technical interests, or is there a place for interaction between classicists and archaeologists, for example?
Sapna, you could help me on this, but I think that evolved over the course of the project. I think at the very outset, when it was called the Bridge Building, I think there was an intention to co-locate other academic discipline researchers here in this building, and that it would be like you would have hubs of research happening around, I don't know, elections or medical or engineering things, and you'd bring experts kind of from those different departments together and have those researchers co-located here. It kind of evolved more into this is the home for the different programs that were mentioned, and they're supporting the work elsewhere on the campus, but we're not necessarily bringing those researchers and locating them here on campus or in this building.
Great. Thank you very much. And I'm going to now invite Larry to come on stage and talk about the self-guided tour.
Thank you.
I must say, Sam's talk was so remarkable because it showed to me how carefully and how thoroughly they considered the ramifications of existing architecture, existing buildings, and our history. And that's very important to us. So thanks, Sam, that was particularly important. Now, I'm actually going to say a very few words because we're going to close things out and let you go on to the next phase. But as we close this meeting, I want to especially thank both Paul Turner and Sam for their inspiring presentations. But there was a lot of work went behind these, and I want to thank Sapna and Susan Sweeney and Karen Bartholomew were the principal champions of the Paul Turner meeting and this meeting. But there were also many other people, and I'd like to thank the many volunteers. There were many volunteers, members of the Historical Society who played a role in the preparation and the execution and the orderly nature of these programs. And now I just have two final thoughts. First is to tell you about the Stanford Historical Society. The next program, this is the first major public program of our 50th anniversary year. The next major program will be in early winter quarter, and it is going to be a presentation based on new research by two of our most distinguished professors in the School of Education, Mitchell Stevens and Emily Levine, with the very intriguing title, Academic Statecraft, Washington, Stanford, and American Political Development in the 20th Century. So I hope you will join us for this program, and also please consider joining the Historical Society. We're open to everybody. Anybody can be a member, and we'd love to have even more. You will find, too, that the one advantage of joining, of course, is that you will get regular notifications of all of our programs, and we have a number of things. And you can join on our website, which is Stanford Historical Society. Finally, now is an excellent time for you to take a self-guided tour. We have developed a self-guided tour and have materials out there, and you can use those materials today to take self-guided, or they'll still be good if you come back another time. But right now, we think that you may prefer just to sit and talk with your colleagues and so forth, or take the tour. But I really want to thank you all for coming to both of these programs. I think it's been a very good afternoon, and I'm very pleased that you're here. Thank you.